The desert cracked beneath their feet like old bone. Dry winds howled through the Mojave air, and not a single soul stirred until Bella froze. The old Rottweiler let out a low growl, then lunged toward a patch of dirt near the mesquite bush. She clawed, fast, frantic, something buried. And then, a sound, barely a breath, a gasp. Emily dropped to her knees. "There's something alive," she whispered. A paw, then 2 ears, then eyes, blinking against death. This was no ordinary rescue. What Bella found would unravel secrets buried deeper than sand scars, not just on the body but on the soul. And for a girl who hadn't spoken in 2 years, it would become the voice that saved them all. This video carries a powerful message of trauma, hope, and healing. Stay with us. By the end, you'll understand why silence isn't the absence of sound, but of love. The Mojave sun had a way of swallowing sound. Out there, with no trees to echo your thoughts and no buildings to bounce back a single syllable. Silence didn't feel like absence, it felt like pressure. And in that silence, a 12-year-old girl named Emily Pearson hadn't spoken a word in 2 years. Her grandfather, Walter Pearson, had stopped counting the days. 72 years old, recently widowed, and stiff in every joint. Walter didn't believe in healing through pills or pep talks. He believed in quiet spaces, good boots, and the slow work of nature. That's why he brought Emily out here to the edge of the Mojave Desert, where their weathered cabin stood like a stubborn tooth in the sand. The place had belonged to his brother once, a reclusive Vietnam vet who believed peace was found in the shade of cacti and the howl of coyotes. Now it was Walter's by inheritance and, lately, by necessity. Emily had changed since her mother died. It wasn't just that she stopped talking. It was the way her eyes dulled, the way she flinched at music, the way she didn't cry, not even at the funeral. Grief in children doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it just closes the door from the inside. The only living thing that could get through to her was Bella. Bella was a 4-year-old Rottweiler with a limp in her back leg and a chunk missing from her right ear. Walter had rescued her 3 winters ago from a roadside shelter outside Barstow. They told him she was unadoptable, too wary, too rough, too broken. Walter had looked her in the eyes and said, "Yeah, me too." Since then, Bella had become his second shadow and Emily's first anchor. Every morning in the desert was the same. Walter would brew a pot of thick black coffee while Bella waited by the door, tail wagging once every few seconds like a metronome for silence. Emily would sit on the porch with her knees drawn up, sketching in her spiral notebook. Never words, only pictures. That morning had started no different. The heat hadn't hit yet. There was a chill on the wind, and Walter noted it might be the last cool morning for a while. The forecast promised heat advisories. "Let's walk before the sun bites," he said to Emily, not expecting an answer and not needing one. She rose quietly, as she always did, following Bella down the dirt path that looped past dry shrubs, bleached fence posts, and a ghosted-out gas station swallowed by time. Walter walked a few steps behind, hands in his back pockets, giving them space. But something felt different. Walter couldn't name it exactly, but Bella was unusually tense. Her pace was faster, her nose dipped low to the ground, tail erect, ears twitching. At first, he thought it was a coyote trail. They'd passed signs before scat, prints, a few bones. Bella knew better than to chase, but she also didn't ignore. Walter prepared to call her back. Then Bella stopped cold. She let out a sharp, high-pitched yelp, one Walter had never heard from her before. Emily froze. Her sketchpad slipped from her hand and landed softly on the dirt. Bella began to dig. Not pawing, digging. Furious, desperate digging. Her front legs scraped like twin shovels, sending clumps of dry earth flying in every direction. She growled, whimpered, then dug harder. "Bella, hey, what is it, girl?" Walter called out, quickening his step. But Emily had already moved. She dropped to her knees beside Bella. Dust clouded around her. Her thin arms pushed into the dirt, mirroring the dog. Walter reached them just as Bella let out another sharp cry, and that's when Emily gasped. At first, Walter thought it was just the sun messing with him. The sand was shimmering, His glasses were dusty. But when he looked down into the shallow crater Bella had made, he saw something that turned his stomach inside out. Fur. But not the dull fur of a rabbit or squirrel or desert rodent. This was black and tan, damp, flattened, and impossibly rising and falling ever so slightly. Breath. A tiny chest, barely moving, but moving. Walter dropped beside them. His hands hovered, unsure. "Oh God," he whispered. Emily was already pulling at the dirt with both hands, eyes wide, face pale. Bella backed up slightly but stayed close, whimpering low in her throat. Walter reached in, gently brushing away the top layer of grit from the little body. A paw twitched, a faint, rattling inhale. Then it happened. Emily jerked back and shouted loud, clear, and sharp enough to slice the desert in half. "It's breathing. Grandpa, it's still alive." Walter didn't move. He just stared at her, stunned not just by what she said, but that she'd said anything at all. Her voice had come back. 2 years of silence, broken not by therapy or tragedy, but by a dog's frantic digging and the fragile flutter of a ribcage beneath the earth. Walter blinked and whispered, "Emily." But she was already scooping dirt away with frantic fingers, tears streaking her dusty cheeks, repeating over and over, "We have to help it. We have to help it." And Bella, ever watchful, leaned in and gently licked the tiny breathing miracle they had unearthed from the desert floor. Walter looked at the sky, shielding his eyes with a trembling hand. Something had just shifted, and he knew they were no longer out here to escape the past. Something had found them, something broken, something still breathing. Walter had driven into town only a handful of times since he and Emily arrived at the desert cabin. He preferred to stay away from traffic, strangers, and small talk. But today wasn't about him. Today was about the puppy. The little shepherd mix lay curled in the back seat of his dusty Ford, wrapped in 2 old towels. He didn't move much. Every so often, Walter would check the rearview mirror, just to make sure the rise and fall of the pup's ribcage hadn't stopped. His breathing was shallow, but steady enough to keep Walter pushing the gas pedal just a little harder than usual. Emily sat beside the puppy, holding her sketchbook tight to her chest. She still hadn't spoken a word since that morning, since she shouted for the first time in 2 years. Now, her silence felt different. Not hollow, not gone, but quiet, like a candle that had been relit. The animal clinic on the edge of 29 Palms was a small stucco building with a green awning and a wooden wind chime that clinked in the dry air. The sign read, "Desert Hearts Veterinary, Dr. Mira Sanchez." Walter parked, cut the engine, and turned to Emily. "You stay with him," he said. "I'll get help." The bell over the door jingled as Walter stepped in. The woman behind the counter looked up and smiled. She was middle-aged, short, with dark curls and an aura of calm that felt rare in a world too loud. "I need a doctor," Walter said. "It's urgent." Minutes later, Dr. Mira Sanchez was kneeling in the back seat, her gloved hands moving quickly but gently over the pup's body. She didn't speak at first. She pressed her fingers into each limb, checked his pupils, then pulled a small flashlight from her pocket and shone it into his eyes. His tail didn't move. His head stayed limp. When she finally exhaled, it wasn't in relief. "Where did you find him?" she asked, voice soft. Walter gave her the short version. The digging, the breathing, the scream. Mira's jaw tightened. She didn't look at Walter, just continued her exam. "Fractured front leg," she muttered. "Puncture near the ear. 2 lacerations along the rib cage, and..." She paused. "Looks like someone cut his dew claws. Crude job, probably with a blade." Walter frowned. "You think a coyote?" "No," she said, meeting his eyes. "This wasn't an animal. These are man-made injuries." Emily's face paled. Her hand reached slowly to rest on the pup's side. She didn't flinch when Mira gently lifted him from the car and carried him inside. Walter followed, the air feeling heavier with every step. Inside the clinic, Mira laid the pup on a heated pad and began treatment. Fluids, topical antibiotics, a gentle binding around the fractured leg. Emily stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes wide, as if memorizing every motion. After 20 minutes, Mira finally spoke again. "He's lucky to be alive," she said. "If you hadn't found him when you did, another hour in that ground and, well..." She hesitated, then leaned closer to Walter. "I've seen wounds like this before. There's a place, an illegal training site out near desert flats. They take in shepherds, pit bulls, Rottweilers, any breed they think can fight. They train them by hurting them, force aggression through pain. If a dog fails the test, they dump it." Walter clenched his jaw. "Who does that?" he said, more to himself than anyone. Mira lowered her voice. "People with no heart left. They kept the pup overnight." Walter and Emily drove back to the cabin in silence, the seat in the back painfully empty. The next morning, they returned to the clinic. The moment the little dog saw them, his tail twitched once, then again. Emily smiled not with her mouth, but with her whole face. Walter filled out the adoption paperwork while Mira looked on. "You sure about this?" she asked. He nodded. "We're not sending him back to the world that buried him." Emily whispered something so quietly, Walter almost missed it. "Lucky." Mira looked up. "What did you say, honey?" Emily repeated. "His name. It's Lucky." Walter smiled and ruffled her hair. "Lucky it is." That night, Lucky curled up in a makeshift bed beside Emily's. Bella lay nearby, her massive frame forming a half circle around the new arrival. When Lucky whimpered in his sleep, Bella inched closer and gently pressed her nose to his neck. He settled almost instantly. From that night on, Bella never slept without touching him. Walter watched it all unfold from his recliner. He'd never been one to read too much into animal behavior. But this was different. Bella wasn't just protecting Lucky. She was remembering. There was something familiar in the way her eyes stayed on him when he trembled, in the way she nudged his food bowl closer when he didn't eat, in the soft, low grumble she made when she thought he was having a nightmare. Walter remembered what the shelter had told him when he adopted Bella, that she'd been abused, likely discarded, that no one could say exactly what had been done to her, but that she carried it. Now, watching her care for Lucky with something close to maternal instinct, Walter felt a slow ache form behind his ribs. Some scars weren't visible. Some never stopped aching. Still, life found ways to press forward. One morning, Walter opened the door and nearly tripped over his boot. Not because it had moved on its own, but because Lucky had dragged it there. A few seconds later, Bella emerged from the side yard, tail wagging with a hint of amusement. Walter picked up the boot and glanced over at Lucky, who sat innocently at the edge of the porch. "Maybe he's not a fighter," Walter muttered. "Maybe he's just a thief." He slipped on the boot anyway. Inside the cabin, Emily sketched quietly at the table, glancing up now and then to watch Lucky snooze beneath the window. Occasionally, she whispered to him, not loud enough for Walter to hear the words, but loud enough for Lucky to lift an ear. The desert was still, the air warm, and for the first time in a long time, the cabin felt less like a hiding place and more like a beginning. It started with a sound, not a bark, not the wind rattling through the porch screen, not even the distant howl of coyotes searching for a place to belong. It was laughter, small, crooked, barely there. Walter sat up straight in his recliner, blinking toward the hallway like a man unsure if he'd just heard the beginning of a thunderstorm or the end of a prayer. The clock read 2:43 in the morning. The house was still. The desert outside was heavy with dry air and the scent of night sage. He didn't imagine it. He knew that sound. He'd heard it before, years ago, in a hospital waiting room, when Emily was still small enough to sit on his knee. That laugh short, tilted at the edges, more breath than voice. Back then, it came from cartoons and chocolate pudding. This time, it came from the other side of silence. Walter stepped carefully down the hallway, the floorboards creaking just enough to remind him of every year he'd lived. Emily's door was ajar. Moonlight spilled across the wooden floor, brushing over the small figure curled beneath a checkered quilt. Lucky was tucked against her chest, his nose under her chin. Bella lay on the floor beside the bed, ears perked, eyes half open. A sheet of paper peeked from under Emily's pillow. Walter didn't touch it. Not yet. He just stood there, one hand resting on the doorframe, listening to the soft rhythm of his granddaughter's breath. He watched the gentle twitch of her fingers as she dreamt fingers that had been clenched for months, drawing only shadows and unfinished things. Now, they rested. The next morning, Emily didn't mention the laughter. She didn't need to. Her eyes said enough. They were clearer, less glass, more water, alive in a way Walter hadn't seen since the accident. At breakfast, she placed a drawing next to his plate. It was quiet and simple. Pencil on paper. 2 dogs, Bella and Lucky, standing in a cracked stretch of desert. Above them, clouds. Fat ones, drawn with soft smudged lines, as if they might burst at any moment. Rain. Walter blinked. "You drew weather," he murmured, then smiled. "Haven't seen that here in months." Emily only nodded. Her pencil was already back in her hand, sketching something new at the corner of the paper. Later that day, while sweeping the porch, Walter noticed something odd. An envelope. It wasn't in the mailbox. It wasn't carried by the wind. It had been slid carefully under the doorframe. There was no name, no return address, just a sheet of lined paper, folded twice. He unfolded it with a quiet, rising dread. The handwriting was sharp, printed in thick, uneven letters. "Return the dog. It's not yours." No signature, no explanation. Just those 7 words. Walter stood there for a long time, the broom leaning forgotten against the wall. Inside the house, Emily was humming under her breath. He could hear Lucky's nails clicking softly across the floor. Bella paced nearby, a low, guarded growl in her throat, like she already knew something wasn't right. Walter folded the note and slid it into his shirt pocket. That evening, he double-checked the locks on the door. He let Bella roam the front yard longer than usual. She sniffed the fence line carefully, her nose hovering just above the dust. Occasionally, she'd freeze in place and lift her head, ears twitching. Something had changed in her posture. She moved like a dog, trying to remember something. The next morning confirmed his fears. A gray pickup truck was parked just outside the property line, half hidden behind a mesquite bush. It sat idling for 10, maybe 15 minutes before driving off slowly. No license plate visible. No sound, except the crunch of tires over gravel. Bella didn't bark. She didn't lunge or chase like she might have years ago. Instead, she stopped cold on the front steps, looked at the truck, and whined. Not a warning sound. Not anger. Fear. She backed up until she was against the house, her tail low, her eyes locked on the truck as it disappeared behind a rise. Walter didn't say a word. He just watched her. When she finally looked up at him, he saw something in her face he couldn't name. Something broken. Something remembered. Back inside, Emily was crouched beside Lucky, gently wrapping a scarf around his neck. It was one of her old ones, blue with fading yellow stars. Walter sat down at the table and pulled the note from his pocket again. "Return the dog. It's not yours." He stared at the words for a long time, then turned to the kitchen window. Bella sat on the porch, still staring in the direction the truck had gone. Walter's thoughts spun. There was no proof, no plate, no face. But in his gut, in the place that had learned over 70 years when something was wrong, he knew. That wasn't random. That wasn't coincidence. It was connected. Bella had recognized something. Not just the truck, the way it smelled. The sound of the engine. Something visceral. Something that had once made her flinch, or bleed, or cower. And Lucky? That note was about him. Walter folded the paper once more and slipped it back into his pocket. This time, he pressed it flat, smoothing the edges like it might vanish if he was careful enough. But it wouldn't vanish. Not now. That night, he stood at the edge of Emily's room again. She was asleep, her sketchbook tucked beneath one arm. On the wall, another drawing, newer, darker, showed the same 2 dogs from before. But this time, the clouds above them had shifted. The rain hadn't fallen yet, but it was coming. Walter had lived long enough to know when someone was watching. It was a 6th sense, born from war, loss, and too many years working in city maintenance, where silence often meant danger. Over the next few days, the gray pickup appeared 3 more times, never closer than the edge of the property, always parked just far enough away to claim coincidence. But Walter knew better. The visits weren't casual. They were calculated. Someone was checking, waiting, making sure. One morning, just after dawn, he stood barefoot on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the truck idle behind a stand of dry brush. The engine purred low. Bella paced beside him, her body tight and coiled, ears alert. Then came a sound, a faint clinking metal against metal, the noise of chain links rattling softly together. Not loud, not constant, but enough. Bella froze. Her tail dropped. She turned sharply toward the sound, eyes wide, and backed into Walter's leg, letting out a low, anxious groan from deep in her chest. She didn't bark. She didn't growl. She whimpered, and then she walked away from the door, head down, as if retreating from a memory only she could see. That same afternoon, Walter pulled out a dusty tin box from under his bed. Inside were clippings, names, records, scraps from a life he thought he'd put behind him. One name jumped out at him like a knife in the dark. Dean Rourke. He hadn't heard that name in 5 years. Not since the town had been quietly rocked by whispers about a dog training ring out past desert flats. It had all been rumor until it wasn't. Dogs turning up in dumpsters, broken, burned, cut. Someone said they'd seen pits and shepherds being loaded into an unmarked truck behind an old machine shop. Dean Rourke's name had floated up, then connected to a defunct kennel license and a series of dead-end leads. No charges stuck, no arrests made. Eventually, the news cycle moved on, but Walter hadn't forgotten, not really. And now, Lucky scarred, discarded, nearly buried alive, and Bella, quivering at the sound of a chain. It all began to click. That night, while Emily slept with Lucky curled tightly under her arm and Bella dozing by the door, Walter sat at the kitchen table under the yellow glow of a single lamp. He scribbled names, drew arrows, circled locations on a map. Desert Flats wasn't far, an hour and change by truck. And there was still a property out there, registered to Rourke's cousin, technically abandoned, but known in town as a place you didn't trespass without a reason. Walter needed confirmation. He needed backup. So the next morning he drove into town to see the one person with the authority to do something about it. Sheriff Nolan had been in uniform longer than Walter had been retired. A proud, barrel-chested man with silver hair and a reputation for level-headed pragmatism. His office smelled like fresh paper and stale coffee. A framed American flag hung behind his desk, next to a photo of his daughter at her police academy graduation. Walter didn't waste time. "There's a dogfighting operation still active out in Desert Flats," he said plainly. "The man behind it is Dean Rourke." Nolan didn't blink. He leaned back slowly in his chair, fingertips pressed together, like someone preparing to defuse a ticking clock. "Dean Rourke hasn't been formally accused of anything in over 5 years," he replied. "And last I checked, there hasn't been a single documented complaint since." Walter bristled. "That's because the dogs don't talk, Sheriff." Nolan let out a slow sigh and glanced at the door, then back at Walter. "You don't have evidence," he said. "No photos, no witnesses, no report. I can't open an investigation based on your gut feeling and a few bad memories." "I'm Inkley." Walter's voice stayed calm, but his eyes sharpened. "You remember what they found out there last time, don't you?" Nolan didn't answer. "I've got a dog with fresh scars and a granddaughter who hasn't laughed in 2 years until that pup came into our lives. And now, someone's threatening us, parking outside our fence, leaving notes. That sound familiar?" Still, the sheriff didn't move. Walter stood. "You don't want to dig? Fine. But I'm not sitting around while another animal gets buried alive." He walked out without another word. Back at the cabin, the air felt different, charged, like something was building just beneath the dirt. Bella wasn't eating much. At dinner time, she sniffed her bowl, let out a low huff, and walked away, tail drooped. That evening, when Walter dropped a metal wrench onto the workbench by accident, the sharp clang of metal on metal echoed through the house and Bella bolted to the other room, trembling behind the couch. He found her a minute later, curled into a tight ball, eyes wide, She didn't bark, didn't growl. She was remembering. Walter crouched beside her, gently running his hand down her back. "You've been there," he whispered. "Haven't you?" That night, as the desert cooled and the moon hung low over the dry hills, Walter sat alone on the porch. He replayed every detail: the envelope under the door, the truck with no plates, Bella's fear, Lucky's scars, the sheriff's avoidance, and one name repeated in his mind like a drumbeat: Dean Rourke. He'd let it slide once, years ago, when the case slipped through the cracks, when there were whispers but no proof, when justice failed, the ones who couldn't speak for themselves. But not this time. Not again. Walter looked down at Bella sleeping beside his feet, and Lucky curled into the blanket Emily had laid out. Their bodies touched, forming a quiet shape of trust. "Survival," he whispered into the dark, the words low and rough like gravel in his throat. "We saved one of them before. Now we save him again. But this time we face the devil head on. Me." And then he sat back in the rocking chair and waited for morning. The desert didn't make noise at night. It breathed. Low winds pushed sand like whispers through dry brush, and the cabin creaked in its joints the way old bones do when the world gets cold. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote called, distant and uninterested. Inside the house, all was still, until Bella's growl pierced the quiet. It wasn't loud, not at first. A low, rumbling warning from deep in her chest. She stood suddenly, ears stiff, muscles tense, eyes locked on the back door. Walter stirred in bed, one arm flinging toward the nightstand. Before he could sit up, the sound changed. A yelp, sharp, pained, then silence, and then Emily's voice. A panicked banging on his door, her fists hammering the wood like thunder in a canyon. "Grandpa, he's gone. Lucky's gone." Walter was out of bed in an instant, pulling his boots on with hands that shook more from fury than age. He burst out of the room, heart pounding, only to find Emily in the hallway, barefoot in her pajamas, her face streaked with fresh tears. "Where is he?" he asked. "I don't know," she sobbed. The gate was open. Bella was bleeding. She tried to stop them. Walter ran outside barefoot, gravel biting into his soles. The back gate, which he always latched before bed, was hanging loose on one hinge. Blood speckled the dirt near Bella's water bowl. And behind the coop, where Lucky sometimes slept, a fresh trail of tire marks cut through the gravel too wide for a car. Truck tires. He scanned the yard. No sign of Lucky. Bella lay near the porch, whimpering, a deep gash above her shoulder, her eyes glassy. She tried to stand, but collapsed again with a pitiful moan. Walter crouched beside her, pressing a towel to the wound. His voice cracked. "You did your best, girl. You tried." Ugh. Emily knelt beside them, one hand resting gently on Bella's neck. Walter stood slowly and stared into the dark horizon. Dean had come. The next morning, Walter went straight to the sheriff's office. He didn't bother knocking. He shoved the door open, startling a young deputy who nearly dropped his coffee. Sheriff Nolan looked up from behind his desk, calm as ever. "I need a search warrant," Walter said. "For where?" Nolan asked flatly. "Dean Rourke's property. Out near Desert Flats. He took my dog." "You have proof of that?" Nolan asked, folding his arms. "I have a wounded animal, tire tracks, and a granddaughter who watched her best friend vanish in the night." "But you didn't see him," Nolan said. "No eyewitness, no plates. That property's private. I can't authorize anything without cause." Walter clenched his fists. "You don't need cause. You need a conscience." Nolan held his gaze. "You want justice, Pearson. Get me something I can use. Until then, don't trespass. You'll only make it worse." Walter slammed his hand on the desk. "How much worse do you want it, Sheriff?" The deputy flinched. Nolan didn't respond. Walter turned and walked out without another word. Back at the cabin, Bella lay wrapped in a blanket. Emily sat beside her, silent, her fingers twitching with the urge to draw but unable to move. Lucky's collar rested in her lap, found snagged on the fence near the gate. It smelled like dust and fear. Walter knew he was out of options. Except one. He pulled out his old address book, the one he hadn't touched since before his wife died, and flipped to a dog-eared page. Raymond Carter, retired cop, former investigator, old friend, the kind of man who didn't mind getting his boots dirty when justice got lazy. Within the hour, they were sitting together in Walter's garage, drinking bad coffee and looking over files. Raymond had brought a small black case filled with his old notes, names, maps, locations. He flipped to a folder marked Desert Flats. Dean was always a ghost, he said, tapping a photo of a weather-beaten barn. We knew what he was doing, but he was slippery, paid off the right people, knew how to disappear. Walter leaned in. What about Bella? Raymond glanced up. I ran her microchip again. Didn't match the rescue shelter where you got her. It matched a batch of dogs seized from an unlicensed training facility 5 years ago. Bella was one of 20 recovered. Most of them didn't survive. She did. Walter sat back, winded. So it was true. She'd been there. She had survived the same hell Lucky had just been dragged back into. Raymond's voice softened. She remembers it, Walt. The chains, the smells, that truck. That's why she broke down when she heard it. That's why she put herself between that gate and your girl's dog. Walter's jaw tightened. He didn't just bury Lucky, he said slowly. He buried Bella's past, dug it up and shoved it in our yard. He stood, breathing heavy now, but not from age, from rage. I let this man go once. I trusted the system, trusted that someone would stop him. And now he's come back to finish what he started. Raymond nodded. We'll find him. We'll do it clean. But you need to be ready. This won't be easy. Walter stepped outside, squinting at the sky. The wind was rising. The air felt dry and charged. Storm coming, maybe. Not from the clouds, but from something deeper. He looked down at Bella, resting now, her breathing steadier. Emily sat cross-legged beside her, Lucky's collar in one hand, her other hand pressed gently to Bella's paw. Walter's voice was steady, low. We save him, he said, whatever it takes. And this time we don't look away. The desert was colder than usual that night. Walter stood by the truck, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind. The stars above were sharp and restless, scattered across the Mojave sky like broken glass. Behind him, the old barn loomed at the end of a narrow dirt road, half-rotted wood, slumped fencing, no lights. Dean Rourke's place. They parked a quarter-mile back. No lights, no noise, no indication of arrival. This wasn't a job for a warrant or a knock at the door. That had already failed. This was justice with a heartbeat. Raymond Carter stood next to Walter, holding a high-powered camera slung over his shoulder. The live stream feed was ready to go, fully charged, tethered to a hotspot. In the back seat, Emily sat with Bella. She refused to stay home, and Walter didn't have the heart or the power to tell her no. I'll keep her in the truck, Raymond said softly. Walter nodded. Bella was already on alert, pacing. She'd been restless all evening. But the moment they turned off the highway onto the broken gravel path toward the barn, her posture shifted. Her nose went low, her ears pulled back. Then she began to lead. No barking, no hesitation. She remembered this place. They followed her through the scrub brush. The property stretched far beyond what could be seen from the road. Hidden pens, makeshift sheds, all silent. But Bella's nose tracked something specific, something pungent and familiar. Then the smell hit them. Not death, not yet, but suffering, urine, blood, rotting food and rusted iron. Walter turned to Raymond. Start the stream. With a tap of his thumb, they went live. The camera lens blinked red. On the screen, comments began to scroll. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Looks like we're online, Raymond whispered. They stepped around the last broken fence post and saw hell. The pens were stacked in uneven rows. Wire crates, some rusted, some newer. Inside, dogs stared back, thin, shaking. Some too weak to stand, eyes dull. Bones visible beneath patches of dirty fur. Walter swallowed hard. He counted at least 20, And in the far corner, separated, in a cage smaller than the rest, was Lucky. He was lying down, his breathing shallow, but he lifted his head when Bella growled low. A flicker of recognition sparked in his eyes. Walter gripped the camera, pointed it toward Lucky. "That's him," he said. "That's the pup they buried and brought back." Comments exploded. "Is this real? Call someone. This is happening right now? Oh my God." Raymond panned the camera over the entire area. "This is Desert Flats," he spoke into the mic. "These are the dogs no one sees, but we're seeing them now." A door slammed behind them. Dean roared. He emerged from the shadows like a memory you don't want, but can't unsee. Built thick, in a stained coat and scuffed boots, a scar riding high on his temple. He walked toward them, slow and confident. "You're trespassing," Dean said, voice like gravel. Walter stepped forward. "You're burying dogs." Dean laughed once, a short bark of amusement. "Don't know what you think you're doing," he said. "But you're leaving now." Walter didn't move. The camera stayed steady. Dean's eyes shifted to the red light on the live stream rig. "What's that?" he snapped. Raymond didn't flinch. "That's the whole world watching." Dean's eyes narrowed. "Turn it off." Walter took one step closer. "You turn yourself in." Dean's jaw clenched. "Last time you poked around, you didn't get squat. This time?" He leaned in close, voice low, venomous. "This time, you'll be the one in the ground, not the mud." Back in the truck, Emily sat frozen, phone in her lap, watching the stream from the dash. Bella trembled beside her. And across town, in his office, Sheriff Nolan stared at the screen on his desktop as the video rolled. He didn't speak, not until his wife called from the other room. "You seeing this?" Then his daughter's voice, from the doorway. "Dad, you can't ignore this." Nolan scrolled through the comments. "Where is this? Send someone now. Tag animal control. Sheriff Nolan or something." Then he saw it. A familiar username. His wife's. She'd typed, "Please, do the right thing." He grabbed his jacket and keys. Back at the barn, Dean had grabbed a metal pipe. He wasn't smiling anymore. "You think that camera saves you?" he said. Walter stood tall. "Number. But it buries you." The rumble of a second truck tore through the night. Headlights flashed over the dirt yard. Sheriff Nolan's cruiser skidded to a stop behind the fence. Doors opened. More officers behind him. "Put it down, Dean," Nolan shouted, gun drawn. Dean froze. For a moment, he looked like he might run, but he didn't. The pipe fell to the dirt. Nolan moved forward with his deputies. In less than a minute, Dean was cuffed and pushed into the back of the cruiser. Walter stood silent, the camera still rolling. Lucky whimpered. Walter rushed to the cage, dropped to his knees and began unlatching the rusted lock. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. We've got you now." Lucky nudged his hand with a tired nose. In the distance, sirens wailed as backup and animal rescue units approached. Raymond ended the live stream, his voice trembling. "That's it," he said. "They can't hide this anymore." Walter stood, Lucky in his arms, the dog's head resting against his chest. Behind him, Bella stood at the edge of the clearing, staring into the dark, as if daring the shadows to come back. They wouldn't. Not this time. The desert didn't change quickly. It didn't bloom overnight, or forgive the sun for how it scorched the land day after day. But sometimes, it gave grace in whispers, in small, quiet ways that didn't announce themselves, only waited to be noticed. Walter stood in the doorway of the cabin, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, and watched as the wind shifted the dust across the front porch. The morning was heavy. The sky, usually sharp and cloudless, was soft with low, silver clouds stretching across the horizon like a blanket someone hadn't quite pulled up all the way. Inside, Emily sat on the floor beside Lucky and Bella, her back against the couch, her sketchbook open in her lap. She wasn't drawing this morning, just watching. Lucky, still thinner than he should be but safe now, lay stretched along the floor, head resting on her thigh. Bella, with her shoulder bandaged and movements still slow, had her nose pressed gently into Lucky's side. There was no sound except for the occasional thump of Lucky's tail when Emily touched his fur. Walter hadn't asked her about the drawings under her pillow. He hadn't needed to. Last night, after the rescue, after Dean had been taken away and the remaining dogs transported to safety, she had gone to bed early. He found the sketchbook on the table an hour later. A new drawing sat on top of the others. It was different from the rest. This time, Emily had drawn herself, standing in the desert between Bella and Lucky. And above them, not a vague smudge of cloud, not a suggestion, but full, dark clouds stretched wide, and from them, long strands of rain fell down like silk threads. She'd shaded the drops one by one, each one placed with care. Walter held that page now, trembling slightly. The paper felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than graphite. And then, like something scripted by the earth itself, a sound tapped gently against the roof. A single drop, then another. He stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled different, softer, cooler, the kind of cool that sinks into your bones after weeks of dry heat. The rain came slow, hesitant, like it didn't want to startle anyone. But it came. Little needles of water dancing across the old boards, speckling the dirt driveway, making the dust hiss softly as it drank for the first time in months. Inside, Emily gasped. She ran to the door, sketchbook forgotten. "Grandpa," she whispered, eyes wide. Walter didn't speak. She stepped onto the porch, barefoot, the hem of her jeans dampening as drops splattered against her toes. Lucky and Bella followed behind her, pressing their noses into the rain. Curious air, tails wagging. Emily stood between them, just like in her drawing, arms by her side, face tilted to the sky. And then she cried. Not the silent, broken tears of before. These were full, unashamed sobs. Her shoulders shook, her fists clenched, and she dropped to her knees on the porch, pressing her face into Bella's fur, then Lucky's. "I'm not scared anymore," she whispered. "I'm not scared." Walter stepped closer, crouching slowly beside them, pulling the three of them into his arms. His voice cracked, thick with something ancient and heavy. "You did good, sweetheart. You brought him home. You brought yourself home." The rain continued, steady now, soaking into the earth, into the wood, into their clothes and skin. But no one moved, because something had shifted, not just in the air, but in Emily. In the weeks that followed, the cabin saw more visitors than it ever had. Reporters, rescuers, volunteers. They came to see Lucky, to meet Bella, to thank Walter for doing what others wouldn't ours. But mostly they came to hear Emily speak. Word had spread about the girl who hadn't spoken in 2 years, whose first words back were a scream for life. And now she wouldn't stop speaking. Not out of panic, not out of fear, but purpose. Together, they started a small nonprofit called Save the Abandoned. It was simple fundraising for rescues, awareness campaigns, adoption events. Walter handled logistics. Emily made the artwork. And Lucky and Bella were the faces of it all. They traveled across California, shelter to shelter, conference to conference. And finally, one autumn afternoon, Emily stood behind a microphone at the Animal Welfare Alliance's annual gathering in Sacramento. She wore a navy blue dress and an old denim jacket covered in hand-drawn patches. Bella, Lucky, a desert cactus with a heart-shaped bloom. Her hair was tucked behind one ear. Walter sat in the front row, hands folded, trying not to show how tight his throat felt. Emily held a small card in her hand, but she didn't look at it. She looked at the crowd. Then she looked down at Lucky, who lay at her feet, calm as a stone. And she spoke. "When I was 10, my mom died in a car accident. I didn't talk for 2 years after that. Not a word. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I just disappeared inside myself." She paused, fingers brushing Bella's head as the dog stood beside her. "But then we found Lucky. Or, he found us." A soft wave of emotion moved through the room. He was buried, left to die, but he kept breathing. He kept trying. Emily took a breath, eyes glistening. "I didn't think I'd ever come back from what I lost. But Lucky did, and that made me wonder if I could, too." She glanced at her grandfather, who nodded once. Then she leaned slightly into the mic and said, "I was buried too, not in dirt but in silence. And Lucky dug me out." The crowd stood, not all at once, but slowly, with that kind of reverence you only see in church or at funerals or weddings moments, when something invisible ties every person together. The applause rose like the first drop of rain hitting dry ground. And Walter, old and tired but wide awake, sat still as stone, letting it all soak in. Sometimes healing doesn't begin in hospitals or homes. Sometimes it begins in a desert, dry, cracked, and forgotten. It begins when an old dog refuses to walk past a patch of dirt. It begins when a little girl finds her voice not through therapy, but through a gasp from something that should have been dead, but wasn't. Emily, Lucky, and Bella remind us, you don't need to speak to ask for help. You just need someone to hear what silence is trying to say. From a whisper in the Mojave, their story rippled across hearts, and as the rain fell on a land that never weeps, a buried soul came back to life and brought with it the courage to keep going. As Viktor Frankl once said, "What is to give light must endure burning." Lucky endured more than we'll ever know, but from his pain bloomed purpose. If this story touched you, please subscribe to Valor Tails. Your support helps us reach 5,000 hearts and inspires us to keep creating stories that heal, teach, and remind us we're not alone. This was not just a video. This was a lesson from those who cannot speak, but always love.